yourself into one as quickly as you possibly can. We have a few groups that are still, with space still available. Reminder as well that your midterm is due in your first tutorial. It's 2 pages double spaced, no more, and it's a course based on your primary source readings for that week, Freud and 10. As I mentioned on Tuesday, the questions are in the syllabus. If you have any questions, you can contact Stephanie, our head TA, or you can contact me. We've also posted a response paragraph. So you have response paragraphs due for your tutorial readings. There's 5 of them due. Take a look at it because it will also help you with the midterm. It kind of gives you an idea of how to choose a sentence, an important sentence in the reading, analyze it, put it in its historical context, and describe its importance. So I would encourage you to take a quick look at that. The terms that I post each day or each lecture will also be posted on Blackboard at the end of the week. I think a few of you had questions about that. And our head TA, Stephanie Carraz, is back with us. I know that probably many of you have already communicated with her by email, but I just want to introduce her so you know who she is and you can put a face to the name if you have any questions here. Last time, of course, we discussed social science, artistic, and philosophical critiques to faith and reason and progress. This is something that is usually attributed to World War I, but as you can see from our discussion, these challenges were actually present prior to the war. Now, we left off with Freud, so I want to continue on with him because he's particularly important. Unlike the other intellectuals that we talked about, they challenged rationalism, but Freud was a scientist. And of course, science in itself embraces rationalism. So he wanted to use the rational tools of science to provide a means to understand and at least control, if not entirely master, the irrational. His life touched upon many of the trends that we talked about in the early 20th century: industrialization, bureaucratization, urbanization, and his life was bracketed, as you'll see, by anti-Semitism. Freud was born in a small Moravian town, what is actually today's Czechoslovakia, to a struggling Jewish wool merchant and his younger wife. And they moved to Vienna when Freud was 3. This was a period of sort of liberal ascendancy in Austria. Jews had received full civil rights in 1867, and Freud was able, in the beginning of his life, to benefit from this. Viennese middle class had also ensured that their capital city became a culture capital of Europe. This sort of positive and reassuring atmosphere changed in 1873 with an economic crisis that sort of heralded in a period of economic depression. This culminated in the election of an anti-Semitic mayor for Vienna in 1895 by the name of Karl Lueger. And he famously insisted, "I can say who is a Jew." Lueger was committed to driving Jews out of public and professional life, so this wasn't a good time for an inspiring young Jewish professional to make a life at the university as Freud wanted. So he decided to study in Paris. And you'll note when we get into the pre-war years that in 1938, Freud was also forced to leave Austria when Germany annexed the country. Unlike Nietzsche, Freud wasn't a professor by the age of 23. He was highly accomplished, but he actually didn't become a professor until the age of 50. He began his career as a scientist in anatomy, and there in Paris, he came under the influence of the neurologist Jean Charcot. He became intrigued with the practice of hypnosis to treat certain symptoms of hysteria. But he felt that the skills that he used to treat hysteria could also be applied to others. So for Freud, the continuum of the scale in terms of abnormality to normalcy there wasn't a sharp divide. So he wanted to take what he'd learned through his study with the neurologist and apply it to human behavior in general. Basically, he wanted to understand the human psyche for all people. Of course, he called his approach psychoanalysis. So for his scientific start, Freud moved into the study of the irrational, or what he termed the unconscious, convinced that he could study it with the same rational tools with which physicians studied the human anatomy. For him, the personality involved three parts. It was much deeper than the surface, and the three components were the id, the ego, and the superego. He concluded that the human mind had this sort of, it wasn't a rational machine, but it was a receptacle for very dark and seething passions, for unconscious emotional needs, for drives, for sexual pleasure, for aggression. All of these desires made up the core of the human personality, the unconscious mind, and this was the id. The thin layer that controlled that controlled the id, was called the ego. And Freud likened it to a man on horseback who's trying to control this sort of unruly beast underneath. He's sometimes carried along by the beast, and sometimes able to sort of repress those aggressive instincts or negotiate them. The third layer was called the superego, and this was the outside layer. So the ego would negotiate between the id and the outside layer, the superego. The outside layer was basically society. It was societal conventions, parental influence, religious conventions, ingrained moral values. The ego mediated between these two layers, trying to make that sort of bundle of passions exist in a world, but also trying not to let it become too repressed by convention. He pulled back the veneer of progress and civilization and found this map of desires, and urges, and drives, and fears that he believed could be accessed through jokes, through psychoanalysis, and of course through dreams. His 1900 work, The Interpretation of Dreams, is one of his most famous works. And it raised the question about society. If a human or an individual couldn't control oneself, what did that mean for society? This week we're going to read in your tutorial a very important work by Freud, and it's called His Thoughts on the Times of War and Death. So if you think about this notion of the irrational core of humans and the sort of precarious struggle to maintain control, you ask yourself, is this fundamentally a pessimistic view of humanity and society? For Freud, it's never possible to maintain full control. And if you did, it would be at the cost of repressing everything that was joyous in human life and everything that made an individual unique. At the same time, if the id was allowed to sort of react without control, it would wreak havoc and chaos on society. So for Freud, the crises of war are basically an expression of a battle that rages at the macro level and at the individual level. This is human existence, it's an ongoing struggle, but there's constancy in that struggle. So, of course, it is a pessimistic view, but Freud saw some hope in the constancy of struggle. If you think about Freud's conviction that the individual personality and even communal life is based on this very fragile control by the human ego and by the consciousness over forces that drives, and that sort of threaten to burst through this thin veneer of civilization, the understanding that he came to isn't a result of World War I. but it provided him the means to try to help to understand the war and the destruction of the war. So that's what you're going to be reading this week. Today, we're going to turn our attention to diplomatic crises. If you think about diplomatic history, it involves different questions. It brings up its own set of questions. When we talked about intellectual history, we talked about the importance, we asked what the role of ideas was in intellectual history. In diplomatic history, questions about agency come up. You often read, Germany did this, France did this, Russia did this, so-and-so reacted in this and that way. But if you think about it, Germany, France, Russia, they can't do anything. They're nations. So they're just concepts. It gives you this sense, again, of a chess game, rather than something that's sort of, than processes that are developing or that are being developed by human beings. So who is actually making these decisions? Where is the agency? The way we study history, countries often begin to stand in for institutions, societies, or elites. Complicated hierarchies of people are masked by these simple concepts. So, thinking about diplomatic history poses the challenge of where particular agency lies. What's the relationship between individual personalities, power institutions, and events? We're going to talk about the origins of World War I and why did this particular war break out in 1914. This was a war that became known, of course, as the First World War. Because as we've talked about with imperialism and with other, and some of the events and crises that came up with imperialism, war, of course, was not inevitable. It's the result of actions and decisions. And the results at the time were unforeseen. For us today, for those of us studying history, we can look at these sort of actions, we can look at misjudgments, they can be analyzed, and they can be debated, and to some extent they can be understood. But it wasn't so at the time. Complex events like World War I have complicated causes, which are caused by a combination of long, short, and medium-term instabilities. I'm going to give you, to start, sort of a brief overview of some of the commonly held reasons for the start of the war, and then we'll discuss them in a little bit more detail. The course of events involved miscalculations, accidents, and contingency. So why war in 1914? We may think that it's for obvious reasons. The assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie. And this, of course, took place in Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia, on June 28, 1914. They were assassinated by Bosnian Serb separatists, and back to some degree by Serbia itself. But if you think about it, assassinations were quite common during this era. Many more important people than Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated. For instance, the Tsar of Russia in 1881. And actually, if you think about the timing, a month elapsed between the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the actual start of hostilities. Of course, there's also the alliance system, which turned Europe into two armed camps. The alliance system was preceded by decades of crisis, and there was this notion that Europe sort of stumbled or slipped or accidentally fell into war. It is true that in many ways the alliance system escalated a relatively minor local crisis into a European and later a world war. But even these factors aren't enough to help us understand this dramatic explosion. A war that lasted much longer than anyone had really expected. Another factor, of course, is people and personalities. There's a notion that prior to 1914, that Europe had seen a century of peace. That after the Napoleonic Wars, there had been no other major conflicts. And so the Europeans stumbled into war in 1914, not knowing what to expect. They had no idea the kind of carnage and suffering it could lead to. But really, there were conflicts and war in and over territories related to Europe, in Europe and then its colonial territories, that produced carnage, and even that did produce carnage, but not international war. So although there is importance to the series of crises that blew up, to personalities, and to the alliance system, it doesn't fit perfectly into 1914. You can't line up and link with hindsight. Some examples of earlier conflicts that, well, actually I want to cover some examples of earlier conflicts that, number one, did not result in international war, and number two, did not lead directly to World War I. In the 1870s, there was war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And of course, Russia and the Ottoman Empire were on opposite sides during World War I. But actually, they were both losers of World War I. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Russia experienced a bloody revolution. The Tsar lost power. And of course, there was a civil war. So you cannot draw, in other words, you can't draw a straight line from the war, the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Russia to World War I. Another example is the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. But actually, Japan and Russia were on the same side in World War I. So relationships were not as obvious either. Sometimes European arch-enemies also cooperated with each other prior to World War I. As we discussed during the imperialism lecture, this was often at the expense of non-European enemies. 1900, for example, was a period of peak competition between Britain and between Germany for naval superiority. And this was the height of what's been called Weltpolitik, which means world policy. Weltpolitik was the policy of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, and he wanted to turn Germany into a global power. He believed he could do this through very sort of aggressive diplomatic relations, by acquiring overseas colonies. As I mentioned before, Germany was a rather late comer to obtaining colonies. And also he thought he could achieve this by the development of a large navy. I can't take questions during class, but afterwards, or during the lecture, but afterwards, come up and see me, okay? So he undertook a naval rivalry with Britain, who at this stage ruled the seas. But in the imperialism lecture, as we saw, in 1900, Britain and Germany actually worked together to put down the Boxer Rebellion in China. So we really can't think that Europeans were on this crash course towards war. It wasn't so clear at the time. One of the most dangerous and frightening crises for Europeans was between France and Germany over Morocco in 1905 and again in 1911. Now, this didn't result in war. It did exacerbate tensions between France and Germany, and it also sort of solidified the relationship between between France and Britain. But after some saber rattling, these crises were resolved by diplomatic negotiations. The French gave the Germans a large tract of land in the French Congo in 1911, and Germany recognized France's control over Morocco. Bringing in Italy, also in 1911, the Italians took over Libya. The French felt again threatened by this incursion, but diplomatic negotiations won out. They agreed to allow the Italians control of Libya in exchange for Italian recognition of French authority, or the French protectorate of Morocco. Again, these crises certainly escalated frictions. But if you think about it, it also provided ways for European powers to draw together at the expense of non-Europeans. The notion of 100 years of peace, progress, and stability after the Napoleonic Wars also doesn't really hold. There was an enormous amount of violence outside of Europe, perpetrated by Europeans, but there was also war inside of Europe. People create this 100 years of peace as an attempt to understand the carnage that came after it. The Crimean War involved most of the great European powers, Britain, French, the Ottoman Empire, against Russia. And this war, there was mass carnage. There was over 1 million dead, and it was in many ways actually a modern war. Newspapers covered it. Coverage was carried by telegraphs back to Europe. So the idea that war, or certain aspects of war, would be shocking to people in Europe wasn't really true. They had some experience with that, even prior to World War I. There were also mass expulsions of populations and massacres in the decades before World War I. It's not easy to say. In Bulgaria, in the 1870s, more than half of the 1.5 million Muslims were expelled, and hundreds of thousands were killed. In the 1890s, in the Ottoman Empire, saw a big massacre of Armenians in 1894 and 1895. Double check Merriam-Webster with that, but I'm pretty sure those are the dates. And at least 200,000 were killed. We also had war in the Balkans. The Balkans were a bit of a tinderbox with regard to peace in Europe. Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece formed what's called the Balkan League. And the intention was to free the Balkans from the Ottoman Empire. They declared war on Turkey in 1912, and the first Balkan War only lasted just under a month. The Balkan League was victorious. However, Bulgaria was enraged by the outcome of this war. Serbia and Greece ended up with sort of large tracts of Macedonia, and so Bulgaria attacked both states. Serbia and Greece then, with the assistance of the Romanians and the Turks, quickly defeated Bulgaria in 1913 in what was called the Second Balkan War. In these two wars, more than 250,000 Europeans were killed, either in combat or through wound and disease. So, really, you don't have to go outside of Europe to see that modern war was very, very deadly. It involved assaults on civilians, mass killing, and this was all covered by newspapers, by telegraph, by photography, and even adventure stories and children's stories. So the argument that Europeans didn't know what war would look like in 1914 isn't entirely convincing. But let's take a look at the factors. be a figure that's familiar to some of you. The diplomatic system in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century is often linked to the German foreign minister, Bismarck. It was called the Bismarckian system. There are a couple of principles to this system. In 1870, of course, Prussia defeated France, and as a result, Germany was unified. And this disrupted the balance of power in Europe. There was another now large unified power. Germany seized the French territory of Alsace-Lorraine. This left France, of course, humiliated, wanting revenge, and wanting its territory back. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire were unstable, and both were trying to sort of pick up territories in the Balkans at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. And I'll show you a map shortly so you can get a sense of where all of these countries are located. Merriman also has very good maps. So they're trying to pick up territories in the Balkans at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, which itself is labeled the sick man of Europe. Britain, of course, is a powerhouse. It has a large navy, strong colonies, but it also has colonial rivalries with Russia for Afghanistan, with France for Egypt, and of course the ongoing rivalry with Germany. Bismarck, however, considered France to be Germany's biggest threat, its largest enemy. So Bismarck developed a very complex alliance system. The whole goal was to try to isolate France. The cornerstone of Bismarck's idea was, sort of the center of his policy, was a friendship with Austria-Hungary. Now this system brought powers together in an alliance against other powers. So it's sort of it's a very different way for power to be structured in Europe. Bismarck's idea was that Germany always wanted to be part of a three-power alliance in a group of five. For Bismarck, the most important partners were Austria-Hungary, but also Russia. And you may ask, why Russia? Well, Germany had a fear of isolation, and they shared a common border with Russia. It was important to build that golden bridge into Austria-Hungary, so that the power in Europe would sort of be centered between Germany and Austria, two countries in Central Europe. But he wanted to keep good relations with Russia. I'm going to outline the key alliances that took place during this period, but I do want to note, here's an example of where your textbook is very useful, because Merriman can provide far more details than I can provide in our time period. In 1879, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians signed what's known as the Dual Alliance, again the centerpiece for both of foreign policy for both empires. In 1882, the alliance is expanded to include Italy. And during Bismarck's time, 1879 to 1890, there is what's termed a reinsurance treaty. And this is a kind of non-aggression pact between Germany and Russia. And it held until Bismarck was dismissed in 1890, at which point the German Kaiser allowed the arrangement to lapse. As a result, in 1892, Bismarck's very worst fear came true, and France and Russia signed an alliance. Later, in 1904, we have the Anglo-French Entente, which was reached over colonial issues, so it was sort of a cordial understanding. In 1907, Russian and British, after having reached agreement by dividing Persia, which is today's Iran, between them,